Alofa lava, and welcome to Pasifika Waiā. In this episode of our podcast, we are very privileged and also honoured to be speaking to the Director of Climate Change Resilience with SPREP, the Secretariat for Pacific Regional Environment Program based in Samoa. It's been a very busy 2 weeks at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. Intense negotiations took place with leaders from around the world, representatives from NGOs, from faith-based organisations, scientists, environmental experts, and our very own Pacific voice was there at the heart of this summit. We're very fortunate to have with us Tagaloa Cooper, who was there in the thick of it in Glasgow, and she joins us here this afternoon. We say very good afternoon. Talofa lava, whakalopalahi atu Tagaloa. So great to be talking to you.
Talofa lava, Gladys, and it's lovely to be closer to home after, what felt like forever away. But it's lovely to talk to you, a friendly face as well.
Mahalo, and it's like I said, good to talk to you. And of course, you're recovering. You're able to have had a bit of a rest, a bit of downtime after those intensive 2 weeks.
No. It seems like it never ends. But also, I'm on Glasgow time, so I wake up at 1 a.m. until now, and then I'll crash in the afternoon and wake up at 1 again. So just taking a bit of time to come right and get into the body clock back in sync with this part of the world. But it's still a lot of work to do and doing that remotely. So I'm in MIQ at the moment, Gladys.
Right.
And it's nice to, I guess some people think of it as being deprived, being in a prison, but it's lovely to be on my own with my own thoughts, and then I catch up with work and catch up with all the meetings that I have outstanding. But it's really good to be in Aotearoa and one step away from home.
Absolutely, and like you said, you're able to have a bit of downtime about what would have been an extremely busy, intensive time in Glasgow. With COP26, there's been a lot of commentary made about some of the outcomes that were down to the wire, in particular with the adaptation of language to do with the agreements. So for you, your observations and take on COP26.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gladys. Yes, a lot has been said. A lot has been said about how it was. I'll start first with the view that it was a failure. And I have to disagree with that. Because there was movement on things that the Pacific prioritized that happened. At the end of the day, and in the very last moments, it could have been a very different outcome had India not pressed for the text to be revisited. In the negotiations, down to the wire, people were tired. People hadn't really rested. It was starting to hum. Their vibe was really positive. People were really positive. And then what it came down to was, and I think some people have been calling it a failure, came really down to the words agreement to phase down coal instead of agreement to phase out. And in the end, that was what people held on to, that felt that it was a complete failure. And yet it cannot be viewed, in my view, it can't be viewed as a complete failure. This is the nature of negotiations. If that had not happened, we would have come away with Glasgow being a great success, similar to the success that was in Paris. where you had high ambition countries come together and lobby for higher ambition. So on a positive note, though, we now come away from Glasgow knowing that countries now agreed to revisit and strengthen their ambitions. Before it was every 5 years, and now they have to revisit their pledges by the end of 2020 now, and that's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's better than waiting 5 years, and so that shows that there is a intention or a willingness by political leaders to ratchet ambition by simply revisiting the NDCs more regularly than the 5 years that was agreed to in Paris. So you cannot call that a failure. There was success around climate finance, which was a priority for the Pacific, because the Pacific also, the general view of the Pacific was that, yes, the Green Climate Fund and such was set up to channel the funding commitments by the developed countries in order for them to then move funding into developing countries to utilize for adaptation and mitigation. And in the Pacific voice is that may be so. And there is an increased ambition to meet the $100 billion target for adaptation by countries. But the Pacific's view is also you can't just walk away. You can't just put your money there and walk away. You also need to make sure that it works for small island developing states like the Pacific. And at the moment, it is difficult. We are finding that there are massive delays in accessing this funding that was designed to benefit developing countries like ours. The delays, massive delays, the hoops that countries have had to jump through in order to access the funding. So you're thinking about a large funding modality. Sorry, I'm probably getting into more content here, rather than the overarching, my view. And you've got probably 20 plus people reviewing and commenting on a proposal that goes back to a small country that's got 2 people at best dedicated to working on it, So that's a big point of contention for the Pacific. So that was a plus, that there is, that it did come out loud and clear that there had to be changes to the big funding modalities to ensure that the money worked for the beneficiaries it was intended to. I think we're heading in the right direction, even though despite that language, and there was so much disappointment in the room, you just felt heavy that happened in the very last hour when everybody was making compromises to get an agreed text. But so on adaptation as well, there was agreement to double the commitment on adaptation within that 100 billion annual target for 2021 to 2025. And this is welcomed by the Pacific. It's needed, it was urgent, and it happened. I mean, it was agreed. On the loss and finance, loss and damage, that was a bit of a disappointment for our countries, because there was efforts, not just within PSIDS, because remember, the Pacific Small Island Developing States, there's only 14 parties to this convention, 14 countries. And they are the PSIDS, the Pacific Small Island Developing States. They also negotiate within a bigger group called AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. So you have the Caribbean countries, Indian Ocean countries, and Pacific countries in that. So it's a larger group. And the way it happens is you can speak for your country, but where you articulate a position on a priority that represents AOSIS, then it's a heavier, bigger voice, stronger grouping. So there's several different groupings. So we come under the AOSIS. So we align ourselves generally to a joint position and priorities because we're similar in nature. In nature, we're developing states, we're island states as well. So that was disappointing because our countries wanted dedicated finance. At the moment, dedicated finance is for adaptation and mitigation, but nothing for loss and damage. Yeah. And so it was watered down. Language continued to be watered down. And in the end, it was globally agreed that there would be a dialogue. For some people, they view that as a step forward because it was never it was always pushed down, kicked down the road. So some people view that as progress. So there's going to be a conversation as a good first step. But the more cynical view is that it's a delaying tactic or another process to delay action, which means maybe down the line we'll talk about it again. Yeah, so, but at least we know on the Paris rule book, which was agreed to in Paris, on Article 6, which is around markets, was finalized. But there are a mixed bag of wins and losses for us, for Pacific SIDS. But, by and large, there were good things that came out of this for us. There was I think there was a lot more discussion around oceans. So for it to be embedded into this process, because us as ocean people, like all of the Alliance of Small Island States, can't talk about climate change and not talk about our ocean. And our dependency on it, etc. And the COP president, the UK's pro-ocean and climate change nexus. I mean, in the end, you could tell that he himself was disappointed.
Yeah.
In the end, and just so frustrating for some of us because it would have been a beautiful ending had that language not been changed, because it would have shown global ambition that we will phase out coal. And now the view is, okay, well, it's something, we'll phase it down. So people have to actively look at doing that, not just talk about it. But even, I guess the protection around that is that they will revisit their NDCs, so that countries have to say how we are going to reduce global climate greenhouse emissions. I'm still a bit tired. This is my bedtime now in Glasgow. So I think it was a mixed bag. Do you know what else, Gladys? The Pacific came hard and strong on their call for 1.5. And there was a partnership with New Zealand around TikTok. There was a TikTok campaign. There was a flex for 1.5. And by the end of that conference, you saw world leaders doing
everyone was doing it. Yeah, I saw
and that was because that was the Pacific that brought that to the halls of that conference. So everybody was doing that, and it was something it boosted morale.
Yeah.
When you see John Kerry doing that and the Prime Minister of the UK doing that. But these are also countries that are very supportive of higher ambition. And then, there was, because not many countries could not many negotiators could go from the Pacific because of passage out, the requirements, because there's only repack flights right now. There were some countries that had no flights out. So some of our countries had to, what's the word, not compromise, be creative or work with what they could. So, for example, Niue's delegation didn't leave Niue, or they didn't attend the COP in person. So they appointed a special envoy who was based in London, who was a son of Niue.
Right.
And he went. We had one of our staff who was accredited to his delegation because he needed the support and did very well. There were some of our delegations who only sent 2 very small groups. So we had to work harder around making the right noise in the right place, raising the profile and amplifying the voice of the Pacific. So we had side events. We had the 2 campaigns, art, storytelling campaign. We also had with Storybox New Zealand, and we also had the campaign for the Flex for 1.5 on TikTok that had about 20 million views.
Nice.
We worked with the Tongan rugby team that was in Scotland.
That's right.
The 1.5, and I didn't realize, but they were a pretty big deal in Scotland.
Yeah.
Our Tongan rugby boys. So we're just really grateful that everybody was doing their bit. And then we got a whole flood of people in the Pacific doing the 1.5. So the Pacific made an impact.
Yeah.
Small in numbers, but Pacific Islanders know how to raise their voice and be heard. Stand out. So you saw people with says throughout the conference. And then we also had a opportunity, which was a high-level event that was chaired by the Prime Minister of Samoa, to meet with the UK COP president. And it was on Monday morning. And really it was because they were very aware that not many people from the Pacific were able to be there.
Yeah.
So they wanted to have that conversation with capitals. So there was quite a bit going on for the Pacific. And then, of course, we had a Pacific space called the Moana Blue Pacific space, which was an office for bilaterals and an office for Pacific countries to work. And it was very busy. And at the end, when there was some difficulty and some stalemate in the discussions, some of our lead negotiators would have smaller meetings there with members of AOSIS or other countries, because it was their space, it was their office, their space away from home. And so right, Gladys, we have a knack for drawing attention to ourselves. I think it's in our DNA. And it was beautiful to see. And one of our last side events, it taught me a lesson, actually, because I'm so involved in my work in serving governments that you forget the place of young people.
Yeah.
Or you just take for granted that they're going to find a space, and we gave the 350 org an opportunity to utilize one of our side event spaces, and they were fantastic. They kind of grounds you. It's ground truthing when you hear young people speak and in a very real way. And then what they did, because Pacific Islanders, like you say, know how to draw attention to themselves. At the end of the event, they had a string of flags, Pacific flags, and they just walked through the whole hall of the negotiations.
Nice.
End, and everybody came out to see them. And then all whoever the Pacific and other people who were not Pacific Islanders just joined them in following the flags of the Pacific. It was just those small personal touches that 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 unites people, right?
Yeah.
Around a cause. And you saw in the end that negotiators were tired because they'd just been working really, really long hours. But
And you
one
spoke about
thing
that.
I do know about being a Pacific Islander is that they're resilient. And they will just go right to the end because our futures depend on it. And so they take very seriously the responsibility given to them. That whole to whom much is given, much is expected.
And you talked about the presence of the Pacific youth at COP26, just the voices that they were able to bring to it, the conversation. For you, would one of the highlights have been seeing the Pacific youth right there at the heart of COP26? They had such a graceful way. There was just watching them as they were advocating, speaking for our lands, for our Pacific, our blue ocean. That must have been heartening to see.
It was lovely to see. And what's quite empowering is that knowing that when they're already negotiators now, but knowing that when they take their place at the table, when these negotiators move on, their training ground has been the actual COP. Yeah, quite different to my time, where at that age we didn't have that access and that kind of platform. So these young people have to be involved now. It's good to see that, because when it's time for them to take over and be moved into these spaces, they will just be, just phenomenal, I think, in my view. And you see it now. They're already really inspirational, inspiring.
And Laura, the work doesn't just stop now that COP26 is finished. The work continues. You've got another round of climate talks in 2022 in Egypt, but the work continues. So where to from here?
Okay, so the work does have to continue, because we have to start preparing by about May for the next COP. But before May, because May is the intersessionals, the pre-sessions, but before May, early next year, we have to do the post-COP analysis, unpack it all. What does that mean for the Pacific? Where to from here? And so we work with all the countries on that analysis. In the end, we're guided by our country's priorities. Our job is SPREP, is to support them, because we don't have a voice in the actual negotiation. So we're guided by them. The current chair of the Pacific group is Samoa. So I think, and also currently Samoa has a seat on the board of the UNFCCC. So it should make things easier that we will be working with our capital in Samoa, but they're also very supportive of the work. And the former chair was Fiji, and also really great leader in this space. So a lot of work has to be done in the lead up to Egypt. And hopefully, I would like to hope that we've learned as we've come along the way, and we've learned from our mistakes, so that we can get better and serve our countries better, so that they can do what they have to do when they are here at the negotiations. And hopefully more of our negotiators can be in Egypt. Hopefully, COVID. We have found a way to live with COVID-19, and it's not so difficult, because I tell you what, this was not a normal COP.
No.
In fact, people question the equitable, like the whether or not it was an equitable COP, because of the social distancing. You had limitations on how many people could be in the room.
Yeah.
So if you're not in the room, how can you even have a voice? In a COP, at a time where social distancing is expected on the first 2 days, we were in the line trying to get in neck and neck, shoulder to shoulder.
No social distancing.
Really like this, moving like this. Everybody wearing masks. You couldn't get in without a negative result. Or you had to do lateral flow test every morning, and then you get the results sent to you by text. They wouldn't be allowed into the venue without it. But people got COVID after the COP. Hopefully not. I haven't heard if it was a massive, large spreader, but we had to be very careful. And it's very difficult to do that in a place where you've got 35,000 humans.
Tagaloa, it's been a long, like you said, a lot of late nights negotiating on the ground at COP26 in Glasgow. You're heading back home to the Pacific. To those who are listening and think, climate change, it's natural, it is what it is, what would you say to them? What would you say to someone who's listening to this now to take it seriously?
What I would say is, climate change is your responsibility, just as it is mine. And it affects everybody on this planet, because we are a global family. The Pacific takes it seriously because our lives depend on how the global family, how seriously everybody else takes this. So my message is that just as much as it is my responsibility, it's you, the listener, it's your responsibility as well, to understand the impacts of climate change, to utilize your voice in any space and opportunity that you have to advocate for greater ambition, for unity around these issues. And if, in particular, if you are a Pacific person, you owe it to yourself, because you cannot separate being a Pacific Island person in this country from your roots in the countries that we come from, because everybody's connected back to the home ground. And I think if everyone takes that responsibility towards climate change as a collective, then our voices are stronger. And the Pacific, we see ourselves as one voice, not voices. So many voices makes that one big voice, and that is who we are.
Thanks for listening. Visit our website at www.pacificawire.com. We welcome you to like us on Facebook, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can listen to the full podcast on Spotify. Whaafatai, Maia Manuia.